Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I know this is a busy time in the semester for faculty and students in particular. This is our second Humanities Now conversation of 2022. And just as a reminder, these conversations are intended for you to learn about how what we do in the humanities connects to contemporary questions and issues, and also to highlight some of the really fantastic research that some of our faculty in the School of Humanities are engaging in. Our next and final conversation of the semester is on Thursday, April 14th, and it will feature Dr. Olivia K. Young, who is a faculty member in art history. Today, I'm happy to share the virtual stage with Dr. Sidney Lu, who is a new faculty member here at Rice University. Dr. Lu is the Gragg Associate Professor of Transnational Asian Studies. He will present Settlers, Communists, and Empire Builders, A Global History of Japanese Rice Farming in Texas. Before he begins, I want to remind you that you can ask questions using the chat function, and you can type those in whenever you're ready, or at the end of his presentation, I'll moderate for Dr. Lu and you can raise your hand and ask a question directly. So without further ado, Dr. Sidney Lu.
Great. Thank you. Thank you to Dean Yarbrough for inviting me. I'm honored to be the speaker today, and thank you all for joining us. So please allow me to share my screen. Okay. I want to begin this map. And it appeared in a pamphlet published in Japan in 1903 that encouraged the Japanese farmers to migrate to Texas to cultivate rice. As you can see, the map specifically points to the coast of the Gulf of Mexico as a destination for Japanese migrants. In fact, in the first decades of the 20th century, hundreds of Japanese migrated to Texas and settled along the Gulf as rice farmers. So my topic today is the stories of these Japanese farmers. For those of you who are already familiar with the history of Asian immigrants in Texas, perhaps this is a topic that is not entirely new to you. But my goal is to place their story in a much wider context of world history and explain how their stories could tell us something new and exciting about the Japanese Empire, about the American West, as well as the global history of colonialism in the early 20th century. So first, I would like to provide some context and explain why the Japanese would migrate to Texas and why they chose to cultivate rice. And this started in 1902 when Japanese consul in New York, Uchida Sadatsuchi, embarked on an investigation trip to the American South. Since the onset of the Meiji era, Japan's empire builders saw the American westward expansion as a central reference. So Japan's own expansion, they believed, would also entail mass migration and settler colonialism. So some actually saw the American West itself as a central stage of colonial competition between Japanese settler colonists and other colonists from other parts of the world. And they believed that the Japanese settler colonies should claim a share of land in the American West. However, the vast majority of the Japanese immigrants who arrived on the American West Coast since the last 2 decades of the 19th century were migrant laborers who simply filled the labor vacuum resulted from the Chinese exclusion. The year when Uchida investigated the American South was also the same year when the Chinese Exclusion Act, promulgated 2 decades earlier, was made permanent in the US. Like many other Japanese diplomats, Uchida worried that the Japanese would soon become a primary target of racial exclusion in the US West Coast, just like the Chinese. As a non-Western modern empire, Japan was anxious and trying and was also trying to prove itself to be as civilized as its Western counterparts. Having its subject treated as racially inferior and excluded from the US would actually harm this goal. So therefore, Uchida came to the US South to explore alternatives to the West Coast for Japanese through Japanese immigration, where the Japanese wouldn't have to deal with racial exclusion. And this was also a time when the elite of Texas wanted to attract the rice farmers to cultivate land along the Gulf of Mexico. Becoming the 26th state of the US in 1845, Texas had been a crucial participant in the transcontinental expansion of the US agricultural capitalism. Even though livestock husbandry was the state's economic engine, Texas quickly became a primary cotton supplier in the country by the turn of the 20th century. After its neighbor Louisiana became the top producer of rice in the US in 1889 by attracting rice farmers to work the coastal lands along the Gulf of Mexico, Texan government sought to do the same in the southern part of the state, an area that shared the coastal line with Louisiana. The completion of the Southern Pacific Railroad connecting New Orleans with Los Angeles and running straight through Texas also expedited the agricultural development and transportation of farm products. The Southern Pacific Railroad Company had obtained a large amount of Texan land along the coastal line, along the railway lines. Motivated by profit, it spared no effort to attract agricultural settlers to the Lone Star State who would purchase its land for rice farming. Originally tasked with investigating the condition for cotton cultivation, Uchida was approached by the leaders of agriculture in Texas, and they expressed a strong interest to attract the Japanese farmers to the state for rice cultivation. And the opportunity of rice farming in Texas coincided with a rising call for the so-called rescuing agriculture campaign in Japan. The Meiji government achieved rapid urbanization, industrialization, and militarization at the expense of agriculture. The sharp increase of land tax had led to a long-term economic depression in the countryside. A lot of small farmers had to sell their land to survive. The outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War dealt yet another blow to the countryside. The war boosted industrial development and lured even more rural people to the cities. The growing urban population and the rising standard of living turned Japan from a rice exporter to a rice importer. From the late 1890s, rice from Taiwan and later Korean Peninsula began to flow into the Japanese market. The decline of the owner-farmer population in Japan and the country's loss of self-sufficiency in rice received immediate attention from Japanese policymakers and intellectuals. Many of them warned the nation about the importance of farming and sought to improve the position of agriculture in the national economy. Some concluded that the rural depression and food shortage were the natural result of overpopulation in the Japanese countryside. And the only remedy was for the empire to expand further by relocating the so-called surplus population in the countryside abroad. The emigration of farmers would kill two birds with one stone. On the one hand, the migration would help to balance Japan's domestic farmer land ratio and improve its agricultural productivity. And on the other hand, the emigrants would acquire more land abroad and facilitate the expansion of the empire. For this reason, Uchida's report was widely circulated in Japanese media and soon inspired hundreds of Japanese to migrate to Texas between 1903 to 1908. Unlike most of the Japanese migrants on the West Coast who made a living as laborers, the majority of those in Texas arrived directly as farmers. The farm owners usually purchase a sizable land ranging from 200 to 600 acres right after their arrival. Most of these farm owners were social elites back in Japan who consciously associated their farm in Texas with their social and political agendas in Japan and with the fate of the Japanese empire more generally. And in this talk, I would like to focus on three of them, including Yoshimura Daijiro, a merchant, Katayama-sen, a socialist and union leader, and Cybara Seito, a politician and the president of a private university in Japan. And through their stories, I would like to illustrate how the ideas and activities of the Japanese rice farmers in Texas were closely tied with social campaigns in domestic Japan, and how they also interacted with the expansion of the Japanese empire elsewhere. I want to start with the story of the Yoshimura Daijiro. And he was among the first to answer Uchida's call. He formed the Society for Friends of Overseas Enterprises in Osaka in 1903, aiming to assist Japanese farmers to migrate to Texas. Together with other society members, Yoshimura purchased 160 acres of land in League City, established a rice farm there in 1904. Though the farm was bankrupt the same year, this experience allowed Yoshimura to pen two guidebooks on American migration for Japanese readers that highlighted the promising future of rice farming in Texas. One is titled Rice Farming in Texas, North America, a New Source of Wealth for the Japanese, published in 1903. And the other is titled Experiment on Rice Farming in the State of Texas, published in 1905. Both books reviewed how Yoshimura associated Texas with his agenda for the Japanese colonial expansion. In response to Japan's loss of self-sufficiency in rice, Yoshimura believed that the migration to Texas would not only provide better opportunities for the farmers who struggled against poverty back in Japan, but also reaffirm the centrality of rice in Japan's national character and the Japanese as the kings of rice farming. As he claimed, I quote, "The courage of Japanese soldiers, the vigor of Japanese rickshaws, and the physical strength of the Japanese women were all results of rice eating," end of quote. While the demand for rice kept growing in Texas, he argued, the white settlers preferred commerce and industry to agriculture. The Japanese were welcomed in Texas precisely because they were the world champion in rice farming and in agriculture in general. Moreover, for Yoshimura, the history of the US expansion in Texas was particularly instructive to the Japanese, as it demonstrated the power of migration and settler colonialism as a means of expansion. And in his imagination, the American migrants first arrived in this Mexican land without any support from their home government. Through diligence and perseverance, they were able to entrench themselves in this foreign territory and made it their own. Operating under the principle of survival of the fittest, they eventually became the owners of Texas. And the US colonization of Texas, Yoshimura contended, represented the overall model of the American settler colonialism that the Japanese should emulate. And the key to such successful venture was to replace temporary laborers with farmers as the main subject of Japanese migration, who were more prepared for long-term settlement in foreign lands. And Yoshimura further saw Texas as a new frontier of Japan's own expansion, and the Japanese farmer migration as an indispensable part of his blueprint for Japan's empire building. Just like the American settlers who colonized the Mexican Texas, Yoshimura believed that the Japanese migrants should have the resolution to make the American Texas a permanent home of their own. He envisioned that the success of the Japanese rice farming in Texas would allow the Japanese settlers to monopolize the rice production in the US, a critical sector of its national economy. And defeating the white Americans in agriculture, as he saw it, would also herald the Japanese expansion in Asia and South America in the following decades. And the second person I want to talk about is Katayama-sen. Katayama was a renowned leader of Japan's socialist movement in the early 20th century. He migrated to the United States in 1884 and worked to pay his own education. Having joined the socialist cause while in the US, he returned to Japan right after the Sino-Japanese War and became a central leader of Japan's growing labor movement and had led labor unions and demanded improved working conditions and better pay for workers. And he believed that overpopulation within Japanese society had partially enabled class-based exploitation. And he argued that Japan's rapid growth of population caused inflation and rising unemployment. The shortage of food and jobs forced a struggling working class to accept jobs with extremely low payment. So he became an advocate for overseas emigration as a solution to the poverty of the Japanese working class. He initially saw the American West Coast as an ideal destination for the Japanese workers who hoped to escape the class suppression in Japanese archipelago. But in response to the rising anti-Japanese campaigns there, Katayama also shifted his focus to Texas. He came to Houston in 1904 and initially worked as a waiter and a chef in a Japanese restaurant. When he purchased 160 acres land and started the rice, then he purchased a 160-acre land and started to farm in Alden, but quickly failed. He then returned to the restaurant and formed a partnership with his owner, Okazaki Tsunekichi. With the financial support of Katayama's donor back in Japan, the two built a much larger farm in Live Oak. But after his donor in Japan realized that Katayama was still involved in socialist activities in Texas, he pulled the money back and leading to the bankruptcy of the farm itself. Afterwards, Katayama moved back to Japan and rejoined the labor movement there. And after the Soviet Revolution, he became a communist and served as an officer of the Communist International in Moscow. And he remained in Moscow until his death and was buried in Kremlin. So for us to have an idea of his importance in Moscow, if you look at the picture on the top, Katayama was a man on the left. So the man in the middle was Alexei Rykov, the premier of Soviet Union. And the person on the right, as most of you may tell, was Joseph Stalin. The picture below is Katayama's tomb in Kremlin necropolis. And the third person I would like to talk about is Cybara Seito. Cybara was a member of Japanese Imperial Diet and the president of Doshisha University in Japan before moving to the US. He established a farm in Webster in 1903. He was both wealthy and well-educated, and his farm became one of the most successful Japanese farms in Texas. And for this reason, Cybara also saw himself as a torchbearer of the Japanese farmers in Texas. He traveled back and forth between Texas and Japan and encouraged people to join him by migrating to Texas. And his farm also became a model farm that attracted attention of a variety of the Japanese elites, including politicians and intellectuals. For example, after an investigation of the farm, Matsudaira Masanao, another member of the Imperial Diet, concluded that unlike the American West Coast, the Japanese migrant in Texas was welcomed by the white settlers. Because of their world-class expertise in rice farming, the Japanese in Texas were treated even better than Caucasians from Italy and Spain. And in his imagination, while the lower class Japanese laborers were targeted by white exclusionists, the capable and educated Japanese, like Cybara, could easily gain the US citizenship in Texas. He expected that the Japanese farmers in Texas, modeled after Cybara, became citizens. It would help the Japanese immigrants in the entire country to gain the right of naturalization. Such a development would allow the Japanese settlers to participate in the US politics and to consolidate their foothold in the country. Seeing rice farming in Texas as a promising model that would bring about a better future for Japanese immigration to the United States, Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs also provided political support to this movement. In 1907, the US-Japan reached an agreement called Gentleman's Agreement. Based on it, in order to avoid provoking further anti-Japanese sentiment in the US West Coast, Tokyo agreed to voluntarily stop the migration of Japanese laborers to the US. However, the Gentleman's Agreement still gave a green light to those who intended to migrate to Texas as farmers, including both the wealthy men like Cybara, who would become owners of big farms, and small, as well as the small owner farmers who would like to collectively manage a farm by pooling together their fund and labor. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs categorized the latter as collective farmers, and managed to negotiate with the US government for the right to migrate. As a result, the doors of Texas remained open to the Japanese farmer migration, at least in theory, until the promulgation of the Immigration Act of 1924 that banned all Japanese immigration completely. The campaign of Japanese migration to Texas ended quickly, however. Most of the Japanese farmers went bankrupt due to the labor shortage and a sharp drop of price in rice. Only a handful of them, including Cybara, were able to survive as farmers. As the Diet member Matsudaira expected, Cybara indeed filed an application for US citizenship in Texas, but his effort proved to be unsuccessful. Cybara's case was echoed by the overall failure of the Japanese immigrants' effort to gain the right of naturalization in the US by the 1920s. Disappointed, Cybara decided to leave the US and remigrate to Brazil. He entrusted the farm to his son and moved to Sao Paulo to start another farm there in 1918. 10 years later, he moved to north to Para, where he was hired by a Japanese migration company to become a director of the Japanese agricultural lab in the Amazon River Basin. Brazil, I would like to point out, was not the end of his transnational life path. Cybara returned to Japan after the Manchurian incident in 1931 and was hired by the Japanese government to conduct investigations in Korean Peninsula and Manchuria to facilitate Japanese colonial migration. At the end of his investigation, however, he became an advocate for the discourse of southward expansion, or nanshinno in Japanese, in the 1930s. Based on his experience in the Amazon, he argued that the future of the Japanese empire was not in Manchuria, but in the tropical south. To this end, he established a colonial farm in Taiwan, where he provided trainings to Japanese farmers who planned to migrate to the Philippines during the Asia-Pacific War. Finally, in conclusion, my talk today discusses the context and meaning of the Japanese rice farms in Texas from a larger perspective. I have explained how the rural depression and the labor movement in Japan stimulated the migration, and how the Japanese farm owners closely associated their effort in Texas with their social and political agendas in domestic Japan. In addition, I have explained how some Japanese empire builders saw the taxes-bound migration as a means of expansion, and also explained the links between Japanese farmers in Texas and the Japanese migration to Brazil and Asia. Perhaps a broader kind of takeaway of this call of my talk is that we need to look beyond the history of Texas and beyond the history of US in general in order to grasp the story of Japanese rice farmers here in Texas. This is the end of my talk. Thank you. I'm gonna stop the screen share.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lu. Okay, so this is the moment when our audience members can ask questions if they'd like. I usually take the prerogative of asking the first question. I feel like I get to do that since I'm hosting. And
yes, please.
This was really excellent and thought-provoking. And so I'm gonna even cheat and roll it into one question, but
Sure.
it's really two, right? So one, I noticed you mentioned, I didn't write down the name of the first of your three examples, but Katayama-san and Cybara Saito are very different. One was a waiter, the other was wealthy, well-educated, president of a university. And you mentioned, I thought the first one was able to buy land right away. And so I had a question about how you would describe the people who were able to come to Texas to be rice farmers. So are they as varied as these three? Or did you see more people who were able to purchase land right away? And if so, how is it that they were able to purchase land right away? And then the second question I have, I think is probably the one you get all the time is, how did the Texans respond to these Japanese migrants? I was kind of, I shouldn't say that because that's going to reveal a lot about myself, but I was a little surprised when one of your examples thought that, oh no, there's going to be less racism in Texas. And so I just wondered what their experiences were like once they arrived. So if you could say something about if there's anything similar about them in terms of demographics or wealth or the age of the migrants, is it mostly men? And then the second is, how do Texans respond? Did they find a more welcoming atmosphere, the more welcoming atmosphere they expected?
Sure. Thank you. I mean, these are great questions. I will still treat these questions as two. So I'll start the first start answer with the first one. So in terms of the differences among the people who migrate to Texas, you're right. There are elites, right? So all the three people I mentioned in this talk are, in a way, elites. So Yoshimura was a merchant, right? He was rich enough to build a organization with his allies. And then purchase land in Texas together, right? Katayama-san, perhaps you're right, he's not that wealthy, but he had a big donor at home, so who actually were able to give him a lot of money. So he was able to purchase the land himself too, in a way, with financial aid back home. And Cybara was a wealthy man as well. So I would say that the Japanese farmers, or there are two types of people overall. There are Japanese farm owners in Texas. There are also the employees of the Japanese farms in Texas who also came from Japan. They are not as rich as the farm owners, right? Some of them came in a way as laborers, but they are still are categorized as farmers, right? They were able to contribute some money, some were not, but generally speaking, they were the employees of the farm owners, right? So they are, I would say, they're divided into two types of people, right? in terms of the elites or the farm owners, right? So they managed to build farms in two different ways, right? There are wealthy people like Cybara who were able to purchase the land by himself, right? And there were also those who like Yoshimura, right? So he formed a society and get some allies, and they purchase a farm together, right? By contribute part of the money themselves, right? So they pull the money together and purchase farm and own it collectively. So these are the kind of a two type of farm owners and the two type of people, right? Farm owners and the employees of the farms. So to your second question, I would say, you know, it's not a kind of a new claim that initially the Asians were treated as white in the American South, right? Some scholars argue that because initially it was, you know, the Asians internal population was so small, right? But later on, definitely the situation changed dramatically, right? What happened in Texas was basically a replication for what happened on the West Coast, right? The Japanese were, victim of Asian exclusion, right? Texas, there are a lot of evidence here in Texas, right? A street called Jap Road, right? Basically has some discrimination in it, right? So again, to answer your question, initially the Japanese elites thought that Texas would be a kind of a welcoming place that they can migrate to, that they won't be treated as racially inferior as they were in California. However, this was actually not true, as is proved, right? Cybara, for example, right? He applied for U.S. citizenship in Texas, right? Because he saw that there might be a hope that he get accepted, right? What happened to him was that his application was received, but he never get a answer, right? It's a bit different from California, right? A famous case was Ozawa Takao, right? He applied for U.S. citizenship. It's basically the U.S. government said no, you can't get U.S. citizenship because you're not white, right? But in Texas, Cybara applied, but the application was received and there's never an answer for it. But I guess it means a polite no, right?
Yeah, that's interesting, right? That they don't even say no; they just don't answer the petition,
right. And yeah, and the context again was that initially the Japanese was wanted. The Japanese were wanted here because the Texas policymakers and the agricultural leaders actually wanted the Japanese here for rice cultivation, right? So they actually were quite enthusiastic about the future of Japanese farms. Again, unfortunately, this was not the reality later on.
Well, we have some questions in the chat. So first we have Cheney Hill, who thanks you for your talk and studies critical Texas studies, and would like to hear more about how Japan felt ideologically aligned with Texas specifically. Why do you think this is the case? What form of regional identity did Texas have that was appealing to Japanese immigrant farmers? And then a second question, also you mentioned that Texas and America more broadly provided a template for settler colonialism. Cheney Hill also asked you to talk more about that, which I know because we were chatting beforehand, you are well prepared to do. So first, that how did Japan feel ideologically aligned with Texas? Why was that the case? What was the appeal? And then second, if you could talk more about settler colonialism.
Yeah, sure. I think these are excellent questions. If I may, I want to answer these two questions together as a big question, because I think the ideological connection between Japan and Texas was actually settler colonialism, the model of a new settler colonialism represented by the U.S. Right, like I mentioned, Yoshimura Daijiro, in his imagination, he believed that the U.S. colonization of Texas is a textbook for Japan's empire builders. Right, it basically told the Japanese how migration can become a means of territorial expansion. Right, how migrants can be colonists. Right, so they believe that while the Japanese can actually imitate what happened in Texas and to build its own empire, right, elsewhere. I'm not sure I answered this question or not, but again, migration can become settler colonial expansion. So this was exactly what the Japanese empire builders learned from the history of Texas. Right.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a question from your colleague, Jaemin Kim.
Hi,
Thank you
Jamie.
for the great presentation. This presentation got me thinking about the fascinating relationship between the Japanese state and Korean settlers in Manchuria. Was there an attempt to recruit Koreans and Taiwanese subjects of the Japanese Empire to migrate to Texas?
That's a great question. Thank you. I did not see any attempt about recruiting the colonial subject, but there was a novel called Hakai, or Broken Commandment. It's about how a Buraku individual, Buraku mean, for some of you who are not familiar with Japanese history, was a type of ethnic minority in a way, or religious minority who have been discriminated due to their kind of a lifestyle or religious belief, if you can argue. So they have been discriminated a lot in Japan in Meiji era and onward. And the novels talk about a individual Buraku person, after he revealed his true identity to people around him. He had been discriminated against a lot. He was a school teacher, but because he revealed his identity, he wanted to fight for the Buraku rights in Japan. He was discriminated a lot. He was criticized a lot, and he failed, on that effort. And then when the novel ended, he left for Texas. The novel described Texas, as a kind of ideal land for ethnic minority in Japan to escape the racial discrimination, to achieve freedom, right? But the novel actually published exactly during the time of this boom of Japanese rice farming in Texas, right? So in a way, it demonstrated that this idea of going to Texas, become farm owner or become rice farmer was actually quite popular in Japan, even appeared in literature. It also shows that actually Texas created the opportunity for some Japanese minorities in Japan can imagine to go and to realize themselves, right? But to come back to your question, there are no kind of evidence showing the Taiwanese and colonial or Korean subject were encouraged or recruited to migrate to Texas. In a way, I think this is understandable because empire builders in Japan actually wanted to migrate the ethnic Japanese to Texas, because in their imagination, these migrants were actually trailblazers of empire, right? They would not give the opportunity to people they are not considered as part of us, right? In a way.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Shivani Bothra, you have your hand up. Would you like to ask your question? And I'll just ask, Cheney Hill has an addition to the question, and after Shivani and Dr. Lu answers, I'm just going to ask Cheney if you would be willing to ask your question aloud so that you can be as clear as you want instead of having to type a whole long thing. So go ahead, Shivani.
Again, I concur. Very interesting talk, Sidney.
Thank you.
I'm further curious to know, actually, was there any specific religious affiliation or identity in the first wave of migration? And then in the second round of the new settlers, did the affiliation change? How does religion play a role in this migration process?
Yeah, sure. Religion does play a role. So Cybara was self-identified as a Christian. So he initially came to the U.S. To study theology, actually. So he was a politician, and he was a university president. He was also a priest, right? In his mind, right, Christianity and empire building and settler colonialism was really kind of closely tied with each other. Katayama-san, believe it or not, was a socialist Christian too, right? In a way, he also connected Christianity with kind of expansion as well. But there are also others who are not Christian, but also migrated. So again, come back to your question. Some did believe that Christianity would play a role kind of in their kind of in the kind of migration, but there are others who are not religious. I'm not sure this answers your question or not.
Oh, yes, yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I mean, I feel bad to put Cheney Hill on this spot, but Cheney, would you like to ask your question directly? I can relay what you've written, but.
No, sure. Can you all hear me all right?
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Sorry, I'm in a public space. But my question was just clarification. You mentioned that the connection between Texas ideology is really tied to settler colonialism, and that settler colonialism served as a template for Japanese nation making. And I'm wondering specifically if the settler colonialism you're referring to is the establishment of the Republic of Texas, and then the immigration by Stephen F. Austin from the U.S. South kind of more generally, and how white settlers, Anglo settlers kind of took over Texas, and then of course established the Republic of Texas before it was annexed to the U.S.
Right. Yes, definitely. Thank you for this further clarification. Yes. So the whole process, right? The settler migration and the formation of Republic of Texas, and then later the annexation of it, right, into the U.S. territory, right? The Japanese empire builders saw this as a whole process of one kind of coherent process of settler colonialism that they can imitate.
Thank you. I think we could have one more question. I'm trying to be mindful of time because I know people have to get to class at 1. Are there any other questions that anyone would like to ask Dr. Lu? Well, seeing that we don't have any other questions, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us today, and to thank Dr. Sidney Lu for this wonderful presentation. And I mean, for me, I feel like our conversations are always a surprise, and I take away some nugget of information, and unexpected, right? Unexpected to imagine this immigration of Japanese rice farmers to Texas. And again, I'm still stuck on them imagining we'll be more accepted in Texas, given the way people think about Texas in the present moment, that they had that impression. So anyway, I'd like to, again, thank you, Dr. Lu, for a great presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you can join me for our final conversation on Thursday, April 14th. Otherwise, have a great day, everyone. Thanks for listening, and thanks for the talk.